As you know, last week we went to the monastery. We had a van load. Actually, we had a caravan. We actually had 3 cars go to the monastery. And it's so funny. It's this beautiful Romanesque church. And, the hills are green and it's raining a little bit. And you go in the church and you have these, it's like walking into the Middle Ages, the feeling. But of course, because the rain, my tennis shoes loudly squeaked the entire time I walked in the door all the way to the seat. So all these people are like praying, and it's like dark and mystical, and it's like, it's like, well, so much for the prayer. But one of the priests that we reunited with, Father Jerome, he was happy to see us, and he and I were texting. The reason I'm bringing it up is you have to have both things in your life. You have to be willing to answer God's call of service, but you also have to cultivate the inner life. You have to have spiritual practices that cultivate the inner life. Because what happens is, if you're only outward focused and you're only out doing stuff, you either get burned out or you become cynical. You become the second son in the parable of the prodigal son, whereby he's doing the work, but he kind of resents it and he doesn't feel closely connected to the Father. And that's the problem. There's not this closeness of intimacy with God. Or the third thing is you just go, well, this isn't true, and you go look for those spiritual practices somewhere else. You go look in other places, and a lot of the spiritual practices across the religions are similar in terms of meditation and prayer and that kind of thing. But the intimacy that we cultivate with Jesus and the Holy Spirit before the Father is very unique. And so it's just a reminder we have to have both. We need to have an outward focus, and we need to have a cultivating of spiritual practices which allow us to be renewed on the inside. And if you don't know how to do that, you can talk to me. And at the very least, that's why we're talking about the Lord's Prayer on our Wednesday night meditations. But there are all sorts of practices, websites, apps. We're not the first people trying to do this, so there's a library of material you can use to cultivate the inner life. And it's important that we have it balanced. Otherwise, we might just end up being those cynical workers in the vineyard, going, "Oh, here, take it." You go, "Well, that's not very nice." I thought, aren't you people supposed to be loving? Whatever. We've got our own problems with the boss. So that's an important part of this. Now, if you've been part of the book group that's meeting on Tuesday, we're going to meet with the synagogue, B'nai Tzedek, in Fountain Valley. And it's a fascinating book about, this guy who was a World War I decorated veteran in World War I, persecuted by the Nazis. He actually took his Iron Cross when he moved to the United States, melted it down, or gave it to melt down to make ammunition to shoot Nazis. So he wanted to use his combat decoration and then he actually went in his 40s and went and fought Nazis in Italy. And his great nephew, who is essentially his grandson, will be speaking next month. And when we hear that Valley of Dry Bones, it's not just an image of poetry. If you know the history of the world, or even the history of that war, there are valleys filled with the bones of God's people, and there has never been any justice for them. There's never been any accounting for the violence they faced. If you've been following the war in Ukraine, one of the most famous and ghastly sites of this violence was the Valley of Babi Yar. In fact, there was some Russian artillery shelling near Babi Yar, and that's where over 30,000 people were shot. And it was the Nazi policy, 1 Jew, 1 bullet. Some of them didn't even get 1 bullet. And when they left, the ground was moving for days with all of the bodies and the gases and everything going on. And so this vision from Ezekiel is a critical question of what is God going to do with all the bones of the people who have never had justice, and not only the people who haven't had justice, the people who committed injustice. What's God going to do with all the remains of the earth? There has to be something beyond just the temporary changing of human beings living and dying, for example. This evening, there will be a small gathering, and you would be invited if you're interested, down at Pier Plaza, Coach's Mediterranean Grill on Main Street. He's recently returned, the owner's recently returned from Turkey, because he's Turkish. And many of us have forgotten the devastating earthquakes that just happened, because we have other news that's constantly hitting us and we can't keep it all in our heads. But over 40,000 people, I think, have died in that. And he was there digging them out and working with relief. And now he's returned, and there's going to be a very small, it's going to be an informal prayer, but I'll be participating and a few religious leaders from the community to at least mark what's happened, to mark the death, to mark the bones of those many people, and to ask for God's mercy and blessing, and also to show solidarity with a business owner in our town. You know, he's one of ours, and we want to show that the suffering of his family matters to us, and that our spiritual connection will be cultivated and shared in that moment. That's at 6 o'clock at Pier Plaza, and again, very informal but important. And it's the question of God dealing with our bones. The bones of the world. I don't know if the first time you ever got an x-ray, you were surprised to see your own bones. You went, oh my gosh, that's me, that's my hand, that's my skull, those are my teeth. Like I just had my teeth cleaned, and every time they do the dental x-rays, it's like, oh my gosh, after I finish gagging on the weird thing they put in your mouth, but like, you go, oh my gosh, those are my teeth, that's my jaw, and there's going to come the day where that's all that is, the bones. Unless you're cremated, and then you've been sort of ground into a fine dust, and we've just accelerated that process of decay. But the problem of the bones is what Ezekiel's dealing with, and the problem of the bones is what Jesus is dealing with in the gospel today. And Ezekiel sees it in a kind of fever dream of prophecy that God's going to do it all at once. And of course we know that God is not bound by time, so in fact, God may have in fact uttered these words, and it's going to be happening outside of time in a way that we don't understand being bound by time. But if you don't want to get into the weird time-space thing, we can just go to the gospel and say it's the same thing. What are they going to do with this body of Lazarus? I mean, this is why they were digging out these tombs, because they would take the body and they would wrap it up with myrrh and spice and other stuff, because they knew it was going to stink. And in the King James Version it says, "He stinketh, O Lord." And they put him on the shelf to decompose. You know, so you get like a year of decomposition. That's why when Jesus is crucified, they bring about 100 pounds of material to deal with what they assume will be his decomposing body, so that they can at least mitigate the smell. Because if you've ever smelled the smell of decomposition, it's a unique and awful, you'll never forget it. You'll never forget the smell of decomposing flesh. Whether it's animal flesh or human flesh, there's something distinctly sweet and awful about it. And that's why when Jesus is born, they give him frankincense because he's a god, they give him gold because he's a king, and they bring him myrrh because he needs to be buried one day. The myrrh was the burial spice. So the myrrh was meant to just cut, it's like whenever someone gives you a cup of coffee and then they pour in a little Bailey's Irish cream or something, and they go, oh, we're just going to cut the coffee, cut the acidity. And you go, well, I need more Baileys, pour in more Baileys. But the myrrh is meant to cut the decomposition. And then after enough time, all that's left are the bones. And then they would gather the bones and they would put them in a box called an ossuary. And then you would put the box up on a shelf, and they were bone boxes. And you can go to museums and see these bone boxes today. And all that's left are the bones. And so this is the problem that Jesus has. Now, you'll notice that when Jesus goes to Bethany, it is not calm. In fact, the disciples think he's walking into a trap. They think he's walking into a national security problem. They go, well, we've done a security analysis, and we think those people that wanted to stone you probably still want to stone you. And you'll notice when they go, all right, come on, move the wagon train out, Thomas goes, all right, boys, time for us to die. It's a little dramatic, but he says that. He really thinks, we are literally walking into a hornet's nest. We are literally walking, these people want to kill you, and you're going to go deal with a sleeping person. Let him wake up by himself. And of course, this is an indication of part of the problem. The problem isn't just bones of the dead. The problem is people living in the valley of the shadow of death who are enthralled and motivated by an avoidance of death, an avoidance of the power of death. It is so powerful that we either can come to serve it, let's use it against our enemies, maybe even against our friends, but let's try and stave it off as long as we can. And then Thomas has that, well, come on, let's do it. Let's go to die. And Jesus is like, really, Thomas? I would love, you just wish there was more dialogue in the Bible where Jesus goes, really, Thomas? Is that necessary, the drama? Well, they want to stone us. It's not like it's not dangerous. And so Jesus is going into a place that's threatening violence, using the power of death. Jesus is also going into a place of grief, people who are brokenhearted because they've experienced death. And this is something we say a lot in the church, is that there are many people who have experienced deep grief, deep loss, often if it's been from a violent death or from multiple violent deaths. And it has to be something that is tended to. Otherwise, you're living with a wound. Like right now, I'm working with the high school students at Huntington Beach High School just for a period of about 4 weeks as they get ready for a show that they're writing. And I said this to the kids. I said, all right, bring something that's unique about your background, but you need to know that when you're writing, don't write from the wound, write from the scar. Because if you're going to write from the wound, people are going to see that you're still hurting and they're going to feel sorry for you. If you can write from the scar, you've dealt with what it was and you can talk about it, but it's in a different way. And there are a lot of people who are living their lives out of the wounds. And so, they say strange things and they get really upset at small things. And it's not because it's irrational, it's because they have this grief and this pain that they're living out of that they don't know what to do with. And so it comes out at the weirdest times. And this is very natural for human grief. And so Jesus is stepping into this human grief. And the first thing he's going to do, and the first thing he'll do with us, in addition to dealing with the bones that we've seen x-rayed eventually, is Jesus comes to change the conversation. Because what has the conversation been? The conversation has been two people saying, well, if God had done this or if God had done that, it would have been different. If you had only been here, God, you showed up too late. Why can't it be like one of the stories where the cavalry comes in and it's like, all right, you got here just in time and we've been able to stave off disaster. No, of course you're too late. And I bet if you have been a person who's experienced the wound of grief or hardship or living out of that wound, that you know exactly what Mary and Martha are talking about because you feel like, God, you never showed up when I needed you. You never showed up when this person was sick, and you never showed up when this person was dying, and I feel like the prayers I was offering didn't go anywhere. I think if we're honest, that's a pretty common experience, and it's not something that we need to be ashamed of or say, well, you shouldn't say that, we're in church. After all, this is supposed to be where we put on our best face. These people are upset that they feel like God missed the boat. And you'll notice that they don't wait for Jesus to come. She goes to Jesus, and she gets right in his face, and she says, if you'd been here, he wouldn't have died. I don't think she's saying that as a friendly, hello, Jesus, if you had been here, he wouldn't have died. She's saying it as an accusation. You missed this. You missed the most important loss. We asked you to come, and you didn't show up. And what they're hoping and what they're imagining in some part is that God is also constrained by the power of death. That God has to somehow act before death happens, because otherwise, once death happens, it's game over. And part of what Jesus is showing is that God is coming not only to deal with us in time and history, but God is coming to change the rules of engagement. I won't talk about it very long, but yesterday was a very important day on the church's calendar, the Annunciation, where the angel Gabriel comes to Mary and says, you're the one God's chosen. And she goes, I'm what? You're the one. And they have that wonderful exchange. But at the end of the exchange, the angel says, what is impossible for humans is not impossible for God. For with God, all things are possible. And so the impossibility of God having anything to say in a world of death is now changed because Jesus goes, oh, I'm fine. He's just asleep. And they go, no, he's not, he's dead. Well, not to me, he's not, he's asleep. And it doesn't mean that Jesus is not somehow empathetic and compassionate. You'll notice Jesus weeps. You'll notice Jesus is moved, and we'll talk about that briefly. But the main thing is the conversation has to change of what's possible. So I'll give you an example. When that lady called this week, and we get people that call us, or we get people that we meet, or solicit us, and the question that we're really asking in our head is, what's really possible with this person? And what you find out is sometimes, and in fact we had another person that we asked to leave this week, because we go, we know you, and our relationship is not such that we can help you. You're asking that question, what's possible? What's possible? And God is asking that question with a different dimension. It's not impossible for me. And so never forget that as you're dealing with God, you are dealing in a different realm of possibility, and that will change the conversation. but it also includes our dying. It doesn't mean that we take that realm of impossibility and just move it into the space before death. It includes our dying, that somehow this will be folded into the promise of God. Now, I know I've gone on a little bit, so I will wrap it up here with just one or two observations. One is, it's said twice, Jesus was moved deeply. Now, I wish they hadn't said that, because it's not really what it is what he was moved deeply, but that doesn't really move us as people. You go, well, what does that mean that he was moved deeply? Again, Jesus was deeply moved by what happened. The verb that's used there, the Greek verb that's used there, is actually a person who's so angry that they snort with their nose. That's I wish they would say, and Jesus snorted with his nose in anger. God is angry about a world that is so broken by death. God is angry about a world that is so afraid. God is angry about a world that is so disconnected. And his anger is not at us. His anger is at death. And so this is God's vengeance. Sometimes people imagine, they say, God's wrath, God's anger, and they just imagine that God is going to be a bigger dictator, a bigger person of violence than we already have. If you have thermonuclear weapons, God has supernatural thermonuclear weapons. If you've piled up bodies in Babi Yar, well, just wait till you see what God's going to do. And it becomes, even Christians can become kind of fear-mongers, taking the world of grace and good news and putting it under this realm of violence and death-dealing. And Jesus is angry. Make no mistake, it says it twice. He's angry enough to snort with his nose. And maybe they didn't want to write that, because I go, what do you mean the Lord is snorting? He's not a snorter. He's Jesus. He doesn't snort. He quietly walks everywhere and doesn't get his robes dirty. He snorts in anger, and his vengeance is, he says, move the stone. Now, if Martha was angry with Jesus when he came, now he's angry. Move the stone right now. Like, what do you mean move the stone? Anger becomes impotent in the face of death. If you've ever had someone that you cared about died and you were angry, what difference did it make? It made no difference, because your anger didn't change anything. It just made you angry. And anger can be very productive when you're grieving, because you just say, why did this happen? This shouldn't have happened. It's a very natural human emotion. Jesus' anger doesn't just change the conversation, he changes the possibility. Really now we're in a different realm, where before it was sort of like theoretical. Well, I know that one day he will live, one day he will rise again. Jesus says that day is right now. Move the stone right now. And then they protest. Well, he stinks, Lord. It's been 4 days. His body's already decompositioning. Move it. And they move the stone. And do you think he goes, Lazarus, come out? I think in his anger, he's probably still nostrils flaring, going, Lazarus, come out. Again, not angry at Lazarus, angry at death. Angry that death has taken human beings, human relationships, the world that God created to be good, and it has turned it into this place of fearfulness, of brokenness, of grief, of woundedness. And so Jesus' violence, or it's not really his violence, his wrath, God's wrath is to bring life. God's vengeance, that's what I meant, not violence, his vengeance. God's vengeance is to break the power of death and to bring Lazarus into this place of fear, into this place of tears, into this place where they're afraid they're going to be stoned to death. He brings Lazarus as a sign of what's about to come. Because he himself's going to go through that in a very short week. But this is just the beginning to let you know that when God comes into the world, God is angry at what it's become, and God will not leave it there. He doesn't just change the conversation, he changes what happens to the bones. And that's why when he says to Ezekiel, Ezekiel, can these bones live? Ezekiel says, well, you know. That's always the prophetic dodge. Sure, well, you're God, you know. Of course you know. Because even Ezekiel's not sure they can live. And you better believe they can live. So when he says, Lazarus, come out, when they say, prophesy to these bones, God's doing it with flaring nostrils, because the anger of God is tied to the love of God that will not leave you dead. And we aren't just talking about some disembodied spiritual reality where you will somehow be with God after you've died. It is the promise that God will take your flesh, renew it all, and the humanity you have will be restored. And indeed, this will be when God's anger becomes a calm love, saying, I told you I was going to do it. Amen.